talk about the fiction that I've read in the last month or so, which is, I've read plenty of non-fiction actually recently, but I don't really talk about non-fiction on the channel. But I've read two novels, I guess, one collection of poetry and 3 graphic novels. We'll start with the graphic novels, go through them quickly. They're all bande dessinée, they're all originally French language, all translated into English by Cinebook, which you can get fairly easily in the UK at least. I don't know in the US. But we have a Blake and Mortimer, S.O.S. Meteors. What a colourful cover. And Blake and this is a solid Blake and Mortimer, I think a strong one even. It suffers from the problem that all Blake and Mortimer stories do by Edgar Jacobs, that they are, that's why this is particularly egregious, they are so covered in text. The art is wonderful. It's clear line, ligne claire, this kind of distinctive style associated with Hergé, Tintin and the Tintin magazine, but with a twist that for Jacobs, who did help draw some Tintin, he was big on shadow, so a lot of the time you've actually got line clarified by shadow. Here the weather in Europe and America is going crazy. There's some kind of plot. People begin to be suspicious. Our heroes begin to be suspicious there's someone behind a variety of things which end up connecting together, both this weather plot and other stuff that is happening. And Blake and Mortimer in Paris having to solve it. And it's good fun. I think it has a very different flavour or tone plot-wise to, say, stuff like the Atlantis mystery, which is the one that comes right before it, or the Great Pyramid, or Secret of the Swordfish, or even the Yellow M, which are those are all the original stories that come before it. Many of them are much more, though this has this strong sci-fi element of there's weather control. Much of the comic is sort of boots on the ground investigation of places in and around Paris, and with kind of, yes, dramatic weather scenes. So it feels very different, and I enjoyed it. The Rhinoceros' Horn in Spirou and Fantasio, which is by Franquin. Spirou and Fantasio have many authors, and it's not quite like, though Blake and Mortimer has continuators, it's not quite the same in that there's not really like one guy everyone thinks this is the guy who's the most important for Spirou and Fantasio. Franquin, though, was a very important early figure, probably the most important of the first couple of creators, but he's not the actual original creator. Here, this is not as strong as other ones by him. Here, Spirou and Fantasio. Spirou is sort of a Tintin figure. Fantasio is a kind of slightly ill-tempered, not idiot, but certainly kind of fool, I guess. You know, he's the bragging soldier type at some level, but more sympathetic. So yeah, this one, they end up essentially looking for some blueprints and travel to Africa, and a variety of places in Africa to do that. And you get some, you know, some representative art on the back. The art is good as ever. The plot and the way it's communicated are at points nonsensical. The jokes are decent. You know, it's okay. And then The Light of Ixo by Roger Leloup in the Yoko Tsuno series, technically still going, though I think the last couple have gotten increasingly poor reviews, I think, as his representational figure art has disappeared. I think some people have criticisms actually the later part of the series in terms of some of its priorities in terms of characters, but at this point we're really in the heyday. This was in 84, 85, 1980, this one, to be fair. And this is part of the, Yoko hangs out with these blue aliens, the Venetians, who she has found and befriended for a colony that was in the earth, basically asleep under the earth in an earlier book. And this one, they are in the Venetian system where they've found Venea and they've started to kind of resettle it, and there have been and will be some adventures there. But here they see a weird light coming from a moon, like just a moon out on a different planet, and they go there and they find a bunch of weird stuff. And it's probably not the very strongest. I think once you actually get to Ixo and you're trying to find out what's going on, everything's really compressed. It feels quite hurried. There's lots of characters there. They've all got motivations, and I could not keep them all straight. I had to keep rereading, which isn't normally how I feel. And it's partly because a lot of them are humans in similar-ish uniforms with blue skin, and to some degree, whereas, say, the main three human characters, you have quite distinctive character designs, and Pocky is a child, so quite distinctive from the other Venetians. A lot of the Venetians ended up looking quite similar, I think, and I was tending to have to use uniform to pick them apart. And I think just because there was a large cast, and probably it wasn't a priority to get 20 really distinct character designs. But yeah, it's fun, and it has some very nice art, but it promises a lot and then sort of falls apart, I think. But yeah, there we are. I finished the Georgics by Virgil, Virgil the Roman poet. The Georgics, most famously book 4. I'd read like book 1 ages ago, and then I read the last 3 books recently. The last book, famously book 4 of the Georgics, famously has a long, not kind of technically reliable discourse on beekeeping, but which is very famous and very well liked. And it was, because all 4 about kind of agriculture, but agriculture partly as a way to tell mythological stories, and partly as a way, sometimes maybe as an allegory for other things that are on Virgil's mind. Certainly, writing as someone sponsored by Augustus's Minister of Culture, Maecenas, you can tell he has an interest in saying, look, the hive needs one leader, for instance, in book 4. But yes, C.D. Lewis gives the translation in sort of iambic pentameter, but not really. Like there's sort of various things. He does all kinds of stuff with the meter. There are sections where it's actually quite pentametrical, and other sections where he abandons that completely. But yeah, it's a lyrical translation with lots of beautiful moments in it. The cornfields deep and the deep sea shudder with the gusts that flick them, and treetops in the forest cry aloud. Pardon me. And long rollers ride to the beach. So flies that wind, sweeping field and flood as it goes. Either that horse, sweating, mouth flecked with bloody foam, will last the distance at Elis and past the finishing post, or his pliant neck is better in harness pulling a curricle. So you can see there's this, pardon me, there's this mixture of lyrical language about nature and kind of just hinting towards a landscape replete with supernatural meaning, which merges into where that was a random section, by the way, where he starts talking about myths. Oh, and this is cool. I learned about beekeeping from this myth. That is actually something he talks about. He says this beekeeping technique about how to breed bees out of dead bullocks. Don't try it. I don't think it works. I'm not sure. Maybe it does work. But he says, I learned about this from this myth about the guy who caused Eurydice's death. And because Orpheus was mad at him, he's cursed. And to get out of this curse, well, because there are a bunch of stages, he ends up breeding bees out of a dead bullock. So he kind of can jump to that. And it has a good English flow. It's a very different experience, I guess, from reading Virgil in the Latin. I read Sundiata, an epic of old Mali by D.T. Niane. This is the most famous version of the Sundiata epic. There are others. There's been a decent amount of kind of ethnographic research, I guess, to try to compare versions, because it's an interesting one where we look at Homer. Homer is the only early epic poet of his form, at least, surviving in any text whatsoever. We know there were other texts not long after his which were available in antiquity, but we only have a few quotations. We also have Hesiod, who gives mythical epic to some degree, but of a different kind. Whereas with Sundiata we have the fruit of 800 years of oral tradition. So we have a very comparable thing in terms of when we look at Mycenaean Greece leading to Homer, and when we look at research in the 19th century in the Balkans on oral culture. So we have there's lots of versions across this whole region, across West Africa, in Mali, Gabon, Guinea, the Ivory Coast, places like that. Sundiata's actual empire was in Mali and Guinea, basically, though he knows of other areas and other peoples. But Niane's was the first, and he names the griot, but he learnt it from a griot. So he's like, hey, I'm just putting this into French from the original languages / from French, and then it's now translated into English. So I can't speak in any kind of with any expertise or detail about the background or the reliability of the texts, other than all cultures tend to preserve stories quite well. But what we do get is it's starting slowly, but getting to a point of a kind of excellent pace and really satisfying. It's only about 100 pages too. Really satisfying short epic of this. First about the kind of precursors, his father, his mother, the buffalo woman, and then he is born. He doesn't walk for a long time, and he walks with a metal crutch to begin with, like he's a cripple. And the sorcerer king, who, well, after his brother comes to the throne, and he has to leave because his stepmother's jealousy, and then his story of exile, and then the sorcerer king who comes and takes over the kingdom, and then he comes and finds allies, his childhood friends, other people dissatisfied with the sorcerer king, and other people again, and brings an army to defeat the sorcerer king of Suso, and to take back over his kingdom, and indeed to build an empire. And he's seen as kind of a success to Alexander, which geographically is not a tiny area. Most of Mali and Guinea is a pretty big space, but it's still stretched probably to compare him to Alexander. But you can see that there's this sense that there's he and Mansa Musa, at one point the richest man in the world, are these figures from this tradition. Musa from a successor empire to Mali. These are representatives of a period where you see significant development, unification, and the creation of wealth in that area. Remember that the armies of the nations in that area had moderate parity with Europeans up to about 1700 or just before, maybe 1650. Technological parity. At that point they fall behind as kind of technological and industrial advantage shifts. But you can see there's a lot of pride in that, an understandable pride, and they're stories that give an identity to, the final chapter is called Eternal Mali, and there's an attempt to give identity to the to this large area, and you can see there's a 20th century concern there, you suspect, in the griot and in Niane telling this story. But yeah, very enjoyable. It's like I say, it started a tiny bit slowly. I wasn't like, this is boring, but I thought, okay, yeah, this is interesting, learning something I didn't know. And then it paces up and becomes really satisfying. So that is Sundiata, An Epic of Old Mali by D.T. Niane. And the final one, the big novel for the month, was Pirate Freedom by Gene Wolfe. A time travel story about a guy in the present. We fairly quickly put this up, so I'm going to count this as not really a spoiler. There is a Catholic priest in the near future, it seems, and he has in some way time travelled back to the 17th century and been a pirate. That seems to be what's gone on. It's not completely clear in every way. There's some questions about timeline, but that is the core of it, and a lot of it is Gene Wolfe enjoying ships and sailing and kind of going, there's a master and commander element going on here. This is it's not Aubrey Maturin, but it's his sort of interest in some of the same stuff, plus the golden age of piracy. He deals with that stuff, frankly, the violence and the brutality. And it's interesting because you have this guy who is now a priest who is reflecting on a violent life, on a in some ways villainous life, perhaps. But that he tries to explain what's gone on and why he thought this at this point, where he's made mistakes. So it's very interesting for that, I think. It is a rip-roaring tale. Always with Gene Wolfe, just read it as if you're reading a story rather than like, oh, I've been told he's so mysterious, I better work out how to read this mystery. Read it as if it were a story first, and this benefits from that a lot, that this is just fun. This is a good story, and it's going to start raising questions. You're going to start being like, oh, how does this reconcile with this? Or am I missing something? Has he not explained something in the way I would want him to explain something? There's also certainly some interesting points when I see criticism about a particular set of moral stances by the narrator, and it's one of those classic ones where they seem to be being taken for Gene Wolfe's by the human author's views, and in fact they're really clearly connected to things that have happened to the narrator. So you've got a thing where the narrator's voice and his opinions about certain things are heavily affected by other events, and therefore create potentially quite a challenging depiction of someone trying to deal with really important, sensitive issues. I don't really want to say more, but it's something I'm using this kind of super therapeutic language, aren't I? But just, he's an interesting, compelling character who doesn't just have opinions you want him to have, but is trying to explain his genuine view of the world, partly based on his own experiences. It's well written. It probably is actually a little bit richer and a little bit looser than a lot of post-New Sun Wolfe, where he's told he has to write more condensed. Maybe it's because it's a story that can fit in 300 pages, 400 pages, whatever it is. I think my version is 300, yeah. Maybe it's because he's like, well, I've got a fairly simple story, so I can tell it in that. And so he is less utterly condensed, but it's still in that later style. It's after Wizard Knight, it's 2007. Or is it 09 or is it 07? I will check that because it slightly frames my next comment. 2007. Yeah, I'd say this and Sorcerer's House both come after Wizard Knight and are both seen as part of a week later period, and they're the two later books I've read, and they're both very good. So yeah, I recommend Pirate Freedom for those who like Wolfe, and for those who don't know Wolfe, it is not at all the worst introduction of all the things you could start with reading Gene Wolfe. I'd recommend other books more, but I think it'd be an okay place. Anyway, what fiction have you been reading? Tell me in the comments, and I will see you next time.